Okay, good morning. We're so lucky today. Our guest is Dr. Richard Bedlack. I heard his presentation at the MND RA Symposium, and I instantly stalked him and invited him on the podcast. Dr. Bedlack is a professor of neurology at Duke University in Northern Carolina. He's a Stewart, Hughes, and Wendt Distinguished Professor, Faculty Network, member of the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences, Associate of the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. Rick, this episode feels a little like to me like the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. Don't freak out. It's an Australian disruptive thinking festival which encourages debate and critical thinking. Rick is going to discuss the phenomenon he's witnessed and is studying of MND reversals. And he'll also tell us about ALS Untangled, which reviews alternative and off-label treatments with the goal of helping people with ALS MND make more informed decisions about them. Rick, what we like to do firstly on this little podcast is to find out who you are when you're not Professor Rick Bedlack. What do you like to do in your off time?
Well, thank you for that question. I hardly ever get that question because I don't have a lot of off time anymore.
Yeah.
But one of the things that's kind of unique about me is just my love of fashion. It's been there since I was a kid. I used to, even as a kid, read fashion magazines, try to watch the outfits coming down the red carpet at the different award shows, and try to replicate those outfits. I couldn't afford any of those clothes, but I could try to replicate what they were doing with stuff from Sears and J.C. Penney.
Mm.
And I just found if I put on something that felt glamorous, that was bright and cheerful and maybe a little wild, that it was kind of like a suit of armor for me, and it could allow me to maintain my positive energy. And sometimes that would rub off on other people and put a smile on the faces of people around me. And so I still love to read about fashion and watch fashion and try to replicate those outfits. And I've just found it's especially important in this career. It's not an easy career that I chose.
No.
And I found that patients and families around the world, they need that positive energy that the things I wear can bring. So it's a win-win.
Well, it's true. I've stalked you and you're very fashionable. I love what you wear. Do you know the Queen said that she always wears bright colors. Why does she wear bright colors? So people can always find her in a room.
Yeah.
I quite like that theory too. So, Rick, I don't know where you want to start. Do you want to start with the spontaneous reversals of MND? I do, because I find that mind-blowing. So start us down
Yeah.
the track of how you first started witnessing this.
Yeah. So it's kind of a progression of, seeing my first patient with ALS probably 25 years ago now, when I was still a resident, and thinking, wow, this is the most amazing and most terrible condition I've ever come across. Hearing my attending at the time that I was learning from say, this is what we call it. We don't know why it happens. People with this disease, they just keep getting worse every day. They're rapidly disabled. They have shortened lifespans, and there's really nothing we can do about it. They just have to go home and get their affairs in order. And just driving home that day and thinking there's got to be a better way. And so that prompted me to stay at my institution and build a clinic that would try to give people options and hope. And in that role, I've discovered a lot of things about the disease that I never would have imagined. The first being that so many people with the disease self-experiment.
Yeah.
And, as I learned that, the internet, of course, was exploding, and now there's more options than ever. Also, the age of misinformation is upon us. And so it's so difficult to figure out what on the internet is real. And so it just seemed to me that there needed to be kind of a clearinghouse of ideas where people with the disease could submit their ideas, and we would, if they got enough interest, we would create a way to crowdsource those ideas amongst clinicians and scientists, write short reviews. And this way that, people with the disease can decide, okay, well, this is what the person selling this is telling me. And this is what a group of, the world's top clinicians and scientists who've devoted their lives to this disease thinks. And based upon all that information, you can make more informed decisions. And the reason I had to give you all that background is because I never would have stumbled upon ALS reversals had it not been for ALS Untangled. ALS Untangled is that program we just talked about, but it was in the midst of investigating one of the ideas that were submitted to us that I found my first ALS reversal, and I had never heard of such a thing. It turned out, as I started to think more and more about this particular ALS reversal and talk to my colleagues, this was not the first one that had ever been reported. They'd actually been reported all the way back into the 1960s in the literature. It's just that no one paid any attention. These cases were reported and people just shrugged their shoulders and said, well, those must have been misdiagnoses, and there's really no point in thinking anymore about them. But they started to add up. In fact, as of today, I've discovered 60 of these. And to me, there's got to be three things to call something an ALS reversal. First, there's got to be a legitimate ALS diagnosis. And what that means is, there's got to be enough information either in the publication or in the records of this person to be sure that they had the right story, the right exam findings, the right EMG, the right testing for mimics. So, I don't count someone as an ALS reversal if they email me and say, hey, I've had an ALS reversal. My next question is, well, great. I'm glad you feel like you're getting better, but, can you send me your records? And usually there's a lot of back and forth with those records to get the information that I need to be sure about this. The second is they've got to have progressed to where there's, some disability. So you can't be an ALS reversal if you say you've got ALS and, your disability was that you couldn't move your pinky finger. There's got to be more than that. You've got to either not be able to communicate, not be able to swallow, not be able to breathe without a machine, or to need help with your dressing, or to not be able to walk. I mean, something significant that's changed in your life as a result of your progression. And then the third is you've got to have recovered that lost motor function and reverse that disability. So again, it's not just that you feel better, there's actually got to be objective evidence that your strength is significantly improved.
Sorry, the dogs are barking.
That's okay. It's
So
real
there has to be,
life, right?
yeah, man, this is real life. So there has to be scientific proof that they have had ALS or do have ALS.
Yeah, and again, the problem with that is there is no test. Like someday there might be a test that we can do that comes back positive or negative for ALS, and it's 100% accurate. That's fantastic. Then there would be no debate about whether someone has it or not. But in the meantime, we have published diagnostic criteria, and they rely on a history, exam findings, an EMG, and testing for mimics. And I could tell you that all the 60 ALS reversals that are in my research program, they all meet those diagnostic criteria. So as best as we can tell today, until the day comes when there's a test, all these 60 people had ALS.
Is there a common denominator amongst all of these people whom have shown reversals?
I wish I could say the answer is yes. They all had, this lab abnormality, or they all had this genetic abnormality, or they all took this product. But so far, I've not found one single thing that all 60 have in common. Now, as you may know, I've got sort of two different research programs underway to try to understand these cases and hopefully make ALS reversals happen more often. The one that I have the most confidence in is called STAR, Study of ALS Reversals, because I think the most likely explanation is there is something biologically different about some people that allows them to be resistant to ALS, so that when they get it, it's not as severe as what most people get. It's kind of like the difference between a flu or a COVID infection in someone who was immunized versus someone who is not immunized. When you're immunized, it doesn't mean you're not going to get these infections, but if you get them, you're less likely to be hospitalized or to die from them. And so that's what I think is the most likely explanation. And actually, last year, we may have found something, and you've probably heard me talk about it in the Australian symposium. We also talked about it in Switzerland last month. So there is something genetically different about a significant number of ALS reversals. They have an alteration in a gene, a promoter gene, for something called insulin-like growth factor binding protein 7, IGF-BP7. They don't all have this, but a significant number of them do. Like, 14 times more likely in ALS reversals than it is in people with typically progressive ALS. And furthermore, about 30% or actually about 15% of the ALS reversals that we could genotype are homozygous for this genetic abnormality, meaning they have two copies of it. We've never seen that
Wow.
in people
Okay.
with typically progressive ALS. We've never seen a homozygote for this genetic abnormality. So this is the most exciting thing that I've discovered in the ALS reversals. What might it mean? Well, if I'm right, the people that have this genetic abnormality, they have a decreased expression of this binding protein. And that decreased expression leads to an increased amount of circulating insulin-like growth factor 1. And that's already well established as a plausible way that people might do better with ALS. Those that have higher IGF-1 levels are known to progress much more slowly than those that have low IGF-1 levels. And so maybe these people with this decreased expression of this binding protein have really high levels, like higher than we've seen before, high enough to actually recover from the disease. And so we're already got a study underway to test this hypothesis. We've got blood samples on a lot of these patients. We're going to be able to look and see, do they really have decreased expression of this binding protein and increased expression of this growth factor? And if that's the case, then we will jump immediately to doing a trial where we try to raise the level of insulin-like growth factor. There already have been attempts to do that. In general, those trials were interpreted as negative. The problem was that the ways that they tried to increase that growth factor probably didn't work. They probably never actually got elevated levels of that growth factor into the brain and spinal cord.
How do you do it?
So I hope what I'll be able to do is work with my colleagues to create an antisense oligonucleotide that knocks down the expression of IGF-BP7. So if I'm right about what's happening in these reversals, that's what starts the whole thing. And so there should be a way for us to knock that down genetically in everyone with ALS. And so ultimately, that would lead to probably a much more robust and sustainable increase in insulin-like growth factor levels. Just giving people insulin-like growth factor, injecting it subcutaneously, it's not going to work.
No.
The body regulates that growth factor too tightly. And so I don't think that the idea is dead from those negative trials. I don't think they did it right.
Okay.
I don't think they raised the growth factor properly.
These reversals, is it genetic and sporadic or a combination of both, or?
Yeah, so amongst the ALS reversals that we've been able to do genetic testing on, we have found 2 of them to have alterations in a gene that should cause ALS. Now, neither one of them have alterations in a very common gene, like we didn't find any SOD1, FUS, C9orf72. We found mutations in SQSTM1 and a mutation in DCTN1. And again, both of these are mutations that have previously been described as causing ALS. We found them in these ALS reversals. And again, to me, that's also important information. The reason is, some people say none of these patients could have ever possibly had ALS if they recovered. Well, it's getting less and less defensible to say that. I mean, they had the right story. They had the right exam. They had the right EMG. They had testing for mimics. And now I'm telling you that some of them actually had ALS causing genetic mutations. I mean, how much of a coincidence are we going to accept here? You're trying to tell me they never had ALS in the first place, but they had the right story, the right exam, the right EMG, the right testing for mimics, and a gene that should have caused ALS. Well, what did they have then? Yeah. So I don't think that's a reasonable argument anymore, especially for these ones that had the genetic mutations.
Are you just doing this at Duke, or are you going to expand it across the country for the testing or across the world for the testing?
This is happening now with collaborators all over the world, this research.
Yep.
So that's one of the things I'm the most proud of is, as you can imagine, when I started this, there was quite a bit of skepticism about whether, looking at this group was going to lead anywhere. But, we've got people involved now from the University of Miami, something called the CREATE Consortium. We've got a group called St. Jude involved, some of the world leaders in genetic testing and genetic analyses. We've got the ALS Therapy Development Institute from Cambridge, Massachusetts involved. So there's a lot of, independent minds that are involved in this. It isn't just me.
How was the feedback in Basel?
I would say it was mixed. I
Okay.
think some people were very enthusiastic that we actually found something, that there's a plausible explanation, and other people remain very skeptical that with such a small number of patients, we're going to be able to find something that, could change the outlook for everybody else with ALS. And I think time will tell.
Are you excited?
Very excited. I mean,
Okay.
you have to understand, I've been working on this ALS reversals research now for probably 12 years.
Yeah.
And this is the most exciting thing that I found. It's the thing that is most plausibly explaining how these people recovered. And it's something that I could possibly give to everyone with ALS. Now, before our listeners get ahead of ourselves, there's still a couple of steps before we're going to know if this is going to lead to a way to reverse ALS in everyone. But to be able to say that there's a chance is pretty exciting.
Hope is what we need. Hope in any
Yeah.
form. Yeah, I can imagine some of the pushback that you're getting as well.
The hard part about being in the space where I am, I would say I'm kind of in the outer limits of science,
Yeah.
right? I'm scientifically trained. I approach everything with the mind of a scientist. I try to be very deliberate, very critical, but I also try to have an open mind, and I'll take anybody's idea and look into it. But the problem is I get it from both sides. I get it from people who are very, very conservative scientists who I have a lot of respect for, who say that even entertaining these ideas is creating false hope.
Yeah.
Which I don't agree.
Mm-hmm.
But I also get it from people who are way out there and not scientific at all. There are groups of people online now who are studying the regimens that some of these ALS reversals took, and they've created entire communities and scientific meetings, and some of them are charging people to go to meetings and learn how to reverse your ALS, or to have one-on-one, teleconferences and to learn how to reverse your ALS. And I mean, I only wish we knew how to do that. I would just encourage people, unfortunately, we have to be patient. We have to wait for the science to catch up. There is no evidence right now that anyone in the world has a protocol that you can buy that will reverse your ALS. And so I would be very skeptical of someone who tells you otherwise.
There are a lot of shysters in the world, Rick, who will take money from anybody. And when you're desperate, you're desperate.
You're right. And that's the problem, is that I understand there's a desperation and people want to just grab onto the next thing that might stop or reverse their ALS. And I wish I had it. But just going back to that word shyster, I mean, con artist is another term I've heard used, and I would never use those terms myself because they imply that we understand the motivation of someone. And I don't, I can't look into their, into their mind and know what their motivation is. All I can say is that right now, there is no science to support the idea that someone has a regimen that stops or reverses ALS. And therefore, someone who's saying that should not right now be believed or followed. That's a scientific critique. It's not a critique that a detective would make who, might study the emails or the garbage pail of someone to learn, who are they really and what are their motivations. Like, that's not my skill set.
Yeah.
I'm not a detective. I'll leave that to 60 Minutes, but I can say there's no science behind what a lot of these people are telling folks to do.
Do you have funding to do?
Yeah, so right now I'm pretty blessed to have first of all time, and this is something that I don't think most of your listeners are going to appreciate, but one of the reasons why we don't have better therapies, one of the reasons why we haven't figured this disease out yet, is because there are very few people in the world working full time to end this disease.
Mm-hmm.
And I never understood this. Like I thought if I came to an institution like mine and I was passionate and creative and hardworking, that I would be able to do whatever I wanted.
Mm.
So if I wanted to work on a disease like ALS that had few treatment options, they would just let me do it.
Mm.
Wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Every single place in the world, the first question is, how is this getting paid for? And so you can't just put up a flag and say, I'm going to be the one who ends ALS and spend all my time thinking about this and working on this without having a way to be revenue neutral
Yep.
for whomever you work for. And, ALS work is not revenue neutral. Like I lose money in clinic.
Yep.
I can't see enough patients with this disease to break even with the billing and the collections that we have. I lose money on the research.
Mm.
A lot of the things I do are unfunded. So the only way that I was ever going to be able to work full time on this was if I could find people who would put together something called an endowed professorship, where it's a pot of money in an account, and the interest from that account used to support a substantial portion of my salary. And so we created that, and I competed for and won it at Duke last year. So I'm Duke's first endowed professor or distinguished professor of ALS because of these families.
Congratulations.
Thanks. But there were these families who understood, yes, we want someone working full time on this disease at Duke. And there's only a handful of people like that around the world. And so I hope that that funding organizations come to recognize that if we want to end this disease, we got to get
Mm-hmm.
creative, intelligent, passionate people working full time on it. It's the same thing's true of anything. You're not going to design the most beautiful clothes if you do it for a few hours a week.
Yep.
You're not going to have the best team as a coach if you only spend a few hours a week, studying and coaching your team. You got to work on things full time to be the absolute best and to be successful. So it's really a tragedy that so few people are working full time on this. And part of it is because I don't think anyone understands that. But yeah, that's where, some of my funding comes from, to design studies. And then I've got a lot of different groups that are interested in the ALS reversals and the ALS Untangled work. And so they're helping to fund that work. So it's all generally right now, all patient funded.
Yeah.
So it's groups of patients that come together, or patient advocacy groups that come together. So some of the groups that have come together, we've got Team Drea, which is a group that's started by Andrea Pete, the first person with ALS to complete a marathon in every one of the 50 states in the United States. She's done a lot of fundraising as part of that quest, and that money has come to the ALS reversals research. We've got Hop on a Cure, which is John Driscoll Hopkins from the Zac Brown Band, a famous American rock and roll band. So that group has generated a lot of money for us. But yeah, we've been Hummingbird Fund with Dr. James Plews Ogan from University of Virginia, a physician affected by ALS, who's become very interested in this work. So yeah, we're blessed to have a lot of funding partners that allow us to do this stuff.
It is cruel that all across the world, so much time is spent raising funds to do this, when we currently still have an end-of-life diagnosis. And I don't know about in the States, but here in Australia, the government just don't wrap their head around it and throw 100K here or 250K there. Mate, it's not going to touch the sides. We need a concerted, proper effort to enable people, like you've just said, to study this full time as a big grown-up adult job,
Yeah. Yeah.
It's frustrating
It,
for all of
it's a
us.
complicated problem. I would say, here in the United States, our patient advocates have been pretty successful in lobbying the US government to spend more time and money on ALS. Like we have something called the Act for ALS that was passed a couple of years ago, signed into law by President Biden, $500 million in new resources for ALS research, including resources, the first ever federal resources for expanded access programs, which is really kind of an amazing thing to see our government funding. I'm glad, because I think it's an important resource for patients, but that's a victory for patient advocacy. I would just say it's a tough problem. Like, I've been to Washington, D.C. many times to talk to members of Congress about ALS research priorities. And I never really appreciated how hard their job is. Like, we criticize them all the time, and I'm sure you do in Australia as well, criticize your
Yep.
government. It's just, it's part of living in a place where there's free speech. We can do that. But the reality is, like, when I went there and I was with patients from my state, to have them tell their stories and to make an ask. But, in front of me, there were mothers and children with muscular dystrophy.
Yeah.
And behind me, there were people who were blind or deaf. I mean, there's a lot of causes that are good causes where there's a need for more research to help people who are afflicted with these things. And the reality is, I mean, there's just no way the government can fund all these causes. There's just not enough money to go around. So I do hope to see, more resources devoted to ALS. Always, it's my passion, but I appreciate also that governments, they have a tough time. There's just a lot of people asking them for money for different diseases.
You're more pragmatic than I.
Well, I think being in those lines and seeing,
Yeah.
you have a chance to talk to people. So I had a chance to talk to mothers whose kids were affected by muscular dystrophy, or
Yeah.
a group of blind people, and hearing about the frustrations they were experiencing. I mean, I think when you put yourself out there and you actually come face to face with what the other diseases, and my own mom with the Parkinson's disease, I saw how few options she had at the end. There just wasn't any research that she could participate in. It's just, when you walk in the shoes of some of these folks with these other problems, you realize, wow, there's really a lot of unmet needs out there. I mean, certainly ALS is one, but there's a lot of other ones too.
Oh, I like you. I like you a lot. Thank you. Now, I know your time is really precious. Just really quickly, if you could the ALS Untangled, that is a website that's available to anybody worldwide.
Yes. Like I was saying earlier, I mean, this all started with the realization that, wow, so many people with this disease are self-experimenting.
Yeah.
Right now, they're getting their ideas from the internet, from websites, or Facebook groups or chat rooms, YouTube videos. I mean, anybody can go online right now and say anything they want about a product. I mean, I could advertise anything I want as effective and safe for ALS, and nobody could hold me to it because there's no internet police. So I just felt like the only people that were talking about these different options were the people selling them. And so I felt like we needed a group of us who were passionate about this disease, but also trained in science to, critique the science of some of these things that are out there being sold. So I set up ALS Untangled. It's a website, www.alsuntangled.org. You can sort of go on there and you can read how it works. But the bottom line is, if you see something, the first thing to do is go to the completed reviews section of the website and see, did we already write about it? And you can read the whole review. If you click on it, you can listen to a podcast about it. You can see the grades that we gave that particular thing. We graded according to mechanism, preclinical models, cases, trials, and risks. And, we grade just like you get grades in school. A's are what you want, F's are to be avoided. And you can see, is this thing that I'm considering spending a lot of money on, does it have decent grades? How safe is it? What kind of bad things could happen to me if I get this? If we haven't already written about it, you can submit your idea. You can see on there how to submit an idea, but it'll eventually get posted on the future reviews section of the website. And there, we probably have 600 ideas that people have submitted to us that we haven't written about. And we look to see how people vote. So there's a vote button next to each idea. If you see something on there that you're excited about that we haven't written about, just click the vote button and it moves up on our priority list. And so the things that get the most votes, we tend to assign them to people on the ALS Untangled review team. There's currently 130 clinicians and scientists from across 11 countries working on this now. And we've got a certain standard operating procedure that we use for gathering information, for writing the draft of the review, for circulating it amongst the team, what we call crowdsourcing, and ultimately for submitting it to a journal where it gets an independent peer review. We respond to that, and then it gets published. And all these reviews are free. You never have to pay anything to read these reviews. And at the end of the day, I mean, we're not trying to shut anybody down. We're not trying to get anybody in trouble. All we're trying to do is give the opinion of a group of clinicians and scientists about this particular idea. And at the end of the day, hopefully that helps patients and families make more informed decisions about the things they're going to buy and try.
Yeah, I would implore anybody listening who is trying. I am privileged enough to deal with many people with MND, and anecdotally, I hear things that they want to try, that they switch around, meds. So jump on ALS Untangled. Don't do it alone. And also, many times, things that you're thinking of doing can be, and this is pretty funny when you have a life-ending disease, but can be detrimental to your health. And, it can ruin what you've got left. So definitely jump on there. And
That's a really important point. Is
yeah,
so often I hear from patients, they'll come and they'll say, "I want to try this," and I might push back and I'll say, "Well, let me just tell you what I'm concerned about." And they say, "But I already have ALS. What worse can happen to me?"
yeah,
Well, you could have ALS and your skin could fall off.
yeah.
You could have ALS and you could have horrific diarrhea. You could
Mm-hmm.
have ALS and an empty bank account, so that
Mm,
now your family's in a lot of trouble trying to take care of you.
mm.
So yes, there are additional bad things
Yeah,
that can happen.
yeah, exactly. Now, Rick, I'm going to let you go because I know you've got other things happening. I am so grateful to you. I am a little bit of a fangirl, but that's okay. I can just keep fangirling in the background. And make sure, Rick, that you look at the outfits from the Golden Globes last night, because a lot of our Aussie girls won the awards and they look pretty damn hot too.
No, I haven't had a chance to do that yet. That was actually on my list for this evening, was to check out the styles. But no, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I just want to compliment you. I know it can't be easy, having lost my mom. Boy, that threw me for a loop, and I really had some thoughts of just walking away from neurology. But
Yeah,
it can't be easy to lose your spouse. That's got to be even harder. And for you to stay involved in this and keep doing what you're doing, I think it's so important. So I applaud you, and I'm glad we're on the same team.
we are, Rick. And if ever I can help, just ask me.
Will do.
Okay, blessings. Thank you very, very much. And I'll be stalking you real soon.
Look forward to working together in the future.
Absolutely. I'm very, very grateful. Happy New Year.
Same to you.
Thanks, babe. Okay.
All right. Yeah. Bye-bye,
Bye.
Jane.
Bye. Thanks, Rick.